This is all about the boot process. Today we'll be going over the role of BIOS and UEFI. We'll be going over the early stages of the boot process, the bootloader and operating system, and then also how to troubleshoot issues within the boot process, and then finally an overview of the whole process. First up is the BIOS/UEFI. The BIOS stands for Basic Input-Output System. It's older and simpler, and the UEFI stands for Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, which is the modern and faster counterpart to the BIOS. It also supports large drives and has a GUI. Both of these are examples of firmware, which is the bridge between hardware and software. Within the early boot process, first, the boot process itself is how a computer goes from powered off to fully running an operating system. So the boot process starts when the user presses the on button on the computer. From there, electricity gets sent from the power supply to the motherboard and then finally to the CPU, which wakes up and looks for instructions from the firmware. The next step in the boot process is POST, which stands for Power On Self Test, and that just checks the hardware of the computer, such as the RAM, the CPU, keyboard, and storage devices. If something fails, the computer will either beep or display a error message, and if not, it will proceed to the next step, which is initialization, which is where the firmware looks for a bootable device, and then it'll find a bootloader on one of the storage devices, and it loads the bootloader into memory, and then once that is loaded in, the bootloader loads the operating system into memory. Once the operating system is fully loaded, the firmware passes control over to the operating system, and you see the login screen. Troubleshooting the boot process can be difficult because there are many ways that it can go wrong. But some things that you can try are resetting the BIOS and UEFI settings, checking the boot order, reseating RAM, replacing the CMOS battery, or updating firmware. And finally, just an overview of the boot process is it powers on, then it goes into the post hardware tests, then initialization of the hardware and the system settings, and then it loads the bootloader, then the bootloader loads the operating system, and then finally the firmware passes control to the operating system and the user sees the login screen. These are my references. Thank you for listening in.